Welcome to History Matters and So Does Coffee. I was about to say so does chocolate, which tells you that I'm really not awake yet and have not had enough coffee.
Or chocolate.
Welcome. I'm going to also turn up my volume here. There we go. Today we're talking about pacing yourself during trying times. A topic which in a sense I don't have to explain, but I will explain sort of the underlying aspect of it. But before I do that, yes, chocolate matters too. Thank you, Katya. I will turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History. And as always, I'm delighted to be with you. We have a large group gathered this morning here in Zoom, and I imagine we've got a bunch of friends over there on Facebook as well. And Joanne will be talking for about 30 minutes, and then I will come back and we will look for your questions down in the Q&A box. So continue to chat away, but if you have specific questions about today's topic, the Q&A is where we will look for those in about a half an hour. I'll see you then.
Wonderful. And I will also say, those of you who are here for the first time, please tell us in chat. Make sure chat is set to whatever the magical language is, everybody, all participants, whatever that is. And everyone, just the word everyone, thank you. Yeah, I really better start guzzling the coffee. But at any rate, make sure that you're set to beam in chat to everyone. And if you're here for the first time, this is really shining the light. Okay. And if you're here for the first time, please tell us and you will be robustly welcomed by the wonderful History Matters community. This is apparently our 180th episode. I'll just be amazed obviously I am, every week I'm like, 180. You know, I mean, I just remember thinking, well, we'll do this for a little while because it'll be good during a pandemic. Years later. Anyway, okay, so let's talk a little bit about today's topic. And partly the topic came about because in the last couple of days, as I was agonizing over what topic to discuss, I thought to myself, it's interesting that there have been times in recent years where not only every day, but sometimes every few hours, there's a new crisis, right? The fire hose of bad level of crisis. And we're not quite in that kind of a moment, not to say that there's not a steady flow of bad, but not in the fire hose sense of the word. And I thought, well, that's interesting, right? Because generally speaking, I don't know about you, but I'm always in a low level state of anxiety because I'm always like watching and looking and thinking and then trying to figure out how to talk about it for the public. But this is feels slightly like a different kind of a moment. I'm not saying to let your guard down, and I will return to that by the end of my comments today, but not fire hose of bad, just steady stream. So that led me to think, how should we be thinking about crises at different kinds of crises at different times? And what might history be able to tell us about that question? How have people in the past dealt with crises, different kinds of crises, different moments in time? And how might that inform us in dealing with whatever, from fire hose to dripping faucet level crises? Oh, for the days of dripping faucet level crises. I don't remember those days at the moment. But at any rate, the past does have things to tell us. And in preparing this topic this morning, I ended up devising what I called the Freeman crisis spectrum. It's not my personal crises, but it is a crisis spectrum that just makes sense. It's nothing about it is remarkably innovative, but it's three kinds of crises, or three categories better, of crisis. And each one, a certain kind of thinking is probably most useful or most common to have. And it's important to realize which moment, which category of crisis you're in to be dealing with what's going on in the best way. So that's essentially the frame of what I want to talk about this morning. And not surprisingly, I'm going to start with one end of the spectrum, which is the extreme end of the spectrum, extreme crises. And also, not surprisingly, many of you probably know, given all that I've said during those 179 previous episodes, Alexander Hamilton had strong responses at moments of extreme crisis. So he's kind of an example of what not to do at moments of extreme crisis, because he does what many of us might be feel as though we're compelled to do, and is not always wisest. Sometimes when in a moment of extreme crisis, you move into a sort of no holds barred, anything, we can do anything, there are no rules, just go attack, be on the attack, whatever your version of that is, charge, without thinking, without even knowing where you're charging into. And Hamilton was really good at that kind of a thing. And particularly in the Revolutionary period and the early years of the Republic, there were lots of moments that could have been charge moments, because talk about contingency. And I'm now back in the zone. I don't know if we're playing bingo, but if we are, somebody just got a key box checked on their bingo card. The Revolution, the 1790s, those are, gee, thank you. My computer just said, hey, History Matters is starting at 10. I don't know why. At any rate, those are a period generally. Those are moments of, and that's a period of extreme crisis. So it makes sense that people would respond impulsively and suddenly and without necessarily thinking things through. And I've written before, and I know I've talked before, about the election of 1800, which is full of those kinds of moments. Actually, it's full of different kinds of responses to crises, but the one that I want to talk about is the no rules apply, no holds barred, an insane person, a fanatic, I guess is the word that the Federalists use, might be president. So we need to do whatever we can do. And Hamilton writes a letter, I know I've talked about this before, to John Jay, who's governor of New York, and says, even though, you know, in New York, they're electing the legislature, and then that will help pick the electors who will help pick the president. But that's what Hamilton is responding to. And he essentially says to John Jay, I know this isn't quite right, but we're in a crisis, the kind of crisis where, and he doesn't put it this way, but essentially rules don't matter, right? The urgency of the crisis, I'm going to sneeze in a moment. The urgency of the crisis means no holds barred, everything off the table. We just, whatever, you know, we're having one of those kinds of moments. And he says, essentially, anything is that we can do, we should do to keep a fanatic, is the word that he uses, like Jefferson, out of office. No holds barred. He has another moment like that, actually during the Revolution. He has a lot of moments like that. So I just had to pick some. And I wanted to pick one that I don't think I've talked about before, that happens during the Revolution. It's during the Battle of Monmouth, I believe, and Charles Lee does not deal with that battle very well, and the troops, American troops, end up running away, and Charles Lee ends up being court-martialed. Those of you who know the musical Hamilton, Charles Lee has a role in there, so you even kind of might feel like you know him. He's quite a character, Charles Lee. But what happens at the Battle of Monmouth, apparently, according to Charles Lee, at his court-martial, so take this with a grain of salt, but Lee says that at the sort of peak moment of battle, and people are running this way and that, and Lee is trying to get things in order in one way or another. And then he says, and there's Hamilton, who comes riding over on his horse to Lee, waving his sword around in what Lee calls a frenzy of valor. Essentially like, no, this should not be happening. We must do, you know, so he goes full on Hamilton impulse, emergency. I'm going to do something and everyone's going to do what I need them to do, and everything will be solved because I always know what's right because I'm Alexander Hamilton. So frenzy of valor is a wonderful phrase. We give it, we can owe that to Charles Lee, but it's another kind of moment. And that's a particular kind of crisis, extreme crisis, battlefield. But that's Hamilton's response, which was perhaps not the best response, right? I mean, if you see a crisis happening and you want to go to the general and say, bad things are happening, we need to act, running up on your horse and waving your sword around above your head might not be the best way to communicate at that moment of crisis. So anyway, that's not the best way to respond in a moment of extreme crisis. It's the way we all want to, right? It's the natural impulse in that kind of moment is to charge in and do something. But there are other examples in history at moments of extreme crisis where people have actually essentially just paused long enough to think about what might happen based on their actions, to think about, gasp, long-term implications, even of immediate crisis-born actions. And John Adams, he's a guy who does this actually more than once. And I didn't set about thinking about John Quincy Adams this morning, but I would assume I put him in the same category because both of them, father and son, they are very, by nature, prone to stop and consider, and are very willing to be unpopular for the choice they make. And as a matter of fact, they feel kind of virtuous when they're unpopular, because it must mean they made the hard choice, but the right choice, and it's okay if people don't like them. It means I made the right choice, because I could have done something that people would have liked me, and it would probably be the wrong choice. So in Adams' case, this morning, what popped into my head was the America's quasi-war with France, the almost war, at the end, very end of the 1790s. And France seemingly has insulted the United States and asked for a bribe to engage in conversations about, as ever, the sort of what's happening at sea, and the French stopping ships, and Britain and France are always going at each other, and the United States gets caught up in the tangle. And it seems as though the three diplomats who have been there have been asked to pay a bribe to begin any kind of discussion. And Hamilton and many Federalists, so it's not just Hamilton this time, they like England. They're not fond of France, which they think is anarchic and going into revolutionary uproar, and they don't think it's safe for the United States to be connected with them. And so in part, they are thinking about the political implications of this particular moment, but their response is build up the army and attack. Go! That this is a moment when we have to really move ahead militarily. And Hamilton actually goes to Adams and says this. And Adams later has an account of it. And I actually didn't look it up and don't remember the precise phrasing, but Adams essentially says something along the lines of Hamilton proved himself to be a fool because he was, act, go now, we must act. And Adams, to his credit, and to Hamilton's ultimate frustration, says, thank you very much for that. And now I'm going to consider what I want to do. And so Hamilton is upset. Federalists are upset. Remember that John Adams is a Federalist. The Federalist Party has divided, not quite between Hamilton and Adams, but those are two factions. And Adams says, yeah, no, I'm not going to immediately build up the army and run. I'm going to pause for just a moment and think. Now, he had to know, and basically on some level, Hamilton probably knew, America was not particularly strong militarily at this point. I probably have said before here, I know I say this in my lecture course on the early republic, that at this point in time, the 1790s, the United States is a fly speck on the windshield of the world, right? We can't really do anything to anybody. So the idea that we can suddenly build up a military, we don't have a standing army really at this point, that suddenly we have to build that up, and we really don't have a navy, and somehow we'll do that, and then we'll be able to fight France. Not the best strategy. Adams says, okay, before we do that, let's consider conversation. Let's consider trying to do something to get us past this awkward moment. And he does this despite the fact that his fellow Federalists think this is the absolute wrong choice, that now is the moment to act, to charge, to move ahead, they're insulting us. This is a moment that requires fighting back. And Adams says, to his credit, no, actually, I think we need to do a few things before we go into that mode, even though emotionally that might make sense. And even though, because he was president at this time of quasi-war and people felt somewhat insulted by France and were somewhat riled up by the spirit of the moment, Adams, for one of the few times in his life, as he rode around as president doing whatever he did, he was getting cheered, right? Like, woo, yay, President Adams at a time of quasi-crisis. He enjoyed that, and that didn't happen very often to him. So he liked the moment, but in that moment of extreme crisis, he said, no, conversation first. And then later in life, when he wrote a series of essays for the Boston Patriot, for a newspaper, looking back on his career to defend himself from people saying nasty things about his career, he says that one of the things that I'm proudest of in my life for having done was pausing in that moment during the Quasi-War and not rushing into a fight. Everyone wanted me to do that. It felt like the moment was right to do that, and I didn't do it. And it was the right thing to do. And my party never forgave me. Everyone, thinks I'm an idiot for having done that, but it was the best thing to do. And you can tell in the way he's writing about it, he still feels sore about having been attacked for that. But that said, it was a moment of war, a moment of crisis, and Adams pauses long enough to say, before we run ahead into this waving our sword above our head, let's think. He has a similar response in many ways to the Boston Massacre decades earlier, in which he chooses to defend the British soldiers who fired at and killed some Bostonians at what becomes known as the Boston Massacre. He decides he's going to defend the British soldiers. They deserve a fair trial. It did not necessarily make him immensely popular. And he said, at the time, actually, I'm trying to remember when this letter was. And later, he says, actually, it's one of the things I've done in my life that I'm proudest of. So in both of those moments, at a time of extreme emotion, a feeling of extreme crisis, he chose to do the thing that he felt was right, partly because of long-term implications, right? He could see in the case of the Boston Massacre that not to act in service of justice and a fair trial could have really bad implications in the colonies, ultimately United States, and in the way that foreign nations saw what was going on in the colonies / United States. In the case of the Quasi-War, long-term, he had to be thinking to himself, really, we're going to go into war? Really, that's going to be smart? Thinking about Europe and everything else, thinking just a little bit beyond this moment, not good. So part of the extreme crisis lesson here, I have a little bit more to go, and I know I'm running out of time. In the case of an extreme crisis, that end of the spectrum, considering long-term implications, even at a peak moment of crisis, is really important. Long-term implications, we live at a moment in which often norms and decisions, norms to overturn decisions are made seemingly with no thought given to a couple of years down the road when someone else might make the same choice and it will be really, really bad, but now a precedent has been set. For example, charging the Capitol and trying to overturn an election, right? That's an extreme crisis, and you're doing that. You might convince yourself that there's a crisis and you must do this, but if you're thinking in the long term, charging the Capitol and overturning an election does not set a good precedent, right? Like, not good. So pausing, this is in line with a lot of what I've said in different ways over the course of the last 179 episodes, is always, we're in such a moment of extreme contingency and extreme emotion. We always need to pause and take a breath and think about, for example, with rhetoric, the motives some people might have at throwing rhetoric at us, how they might want us to respond, how our emotions might lead us astray in the way that we're responding. And this is part of that same logic. Now, the middle, and there are many more points one could have on my spectrum of crises, but middling is what I've just named some middle point in this spectrum. And I would say middling crises are things that happen that obviously look bad and dangerous and cause you to sort of catch your breath, but they're not in the waving your sword above the head mode of extreme crisis. I would say in part, having a presidential candidate chant, lock her up, to me at least fell in the category of middling crisis because it was inherently dangerous rhetoric, back at that innocent time where we didn't even realize what was possible coming from it. But I remember thinking, they're like painting a target on her. It's extreme language. It's bad. What's it doing to our system of justice? Blah, blah, blah. Our own spectrum, our national spectrum of crisis and our personal spectrum of crisis has altered much in the years that have gone recently in the past. But still, middling crises are still going to be moments when something bad is happening and something bad is happening. And it's not necessarily in the middle of a battle, but still, lock her up. That's a moment, again, to take a step back, to take a breath and observe what's happening, because often performative, empty responses to what's going on at the time, they're performative and they're empty and they're there to score points and not necessarily to win battles. So during middling crises, you actually have to consider what is actually happening. Chanting lock her up is bad. Not acting on that is worth noting if the person's not acting on that. So in other words, in a middling crisis, think about what's actually happening in addition to what it means and the implications, because very often in a middling crisis, it means that someone is saying something. There's dangerous rhetoric, threatening actions that feel extreme, but might actually only be threats. And we can see all over the place and are seeing every day the impact of threats, the impact of things that seem dire, and that it feels as though there must be some kind of an immediate response. But if you pause and actually think about a course of action, you might not be so extreme. My historic example of that actually is good old Benjamin Brown French, at the center of my most recent book, The Field of Blood. He talks actually, and it happens more than once, but there's one particular case when there's a Congress, the House is trying to organize to start a new session of Congress, and they can't pick a speaker. It's going on and on. Days are dragging on. People are yelling at each other. Sometimes he gets upset because parties can't indulge each other, discuss anything with each other. Sometimes he's upset eventually because North and South are doing crazy things. But in one of these particular moments, he sees people threatening to not allow the House to be organized if they don't get their way. We're not going to allow this to happen. So there's threats. And in his diary, his wonderful diary, French says something along the lines of, this kind of moment, it makes me feel like the Union is falling to its doom. Like I'm just trailing after the death of the United States. And I'm watching it happen in the House. And you can tell in his diary, it deeply affects him. So he's having a moment where he's like, this is a crisis. It feels like a crisis on a personal level, on a professional level. What he does is, okay, now is the time for me to really focus on the rules. I am the clerk of the House. I know the rules. I know the rules even better than a lot of other clerks of the House have in the past. I'm an expert. I am going to be here present in the moment to help steer what's happening and watch what's happening and call on the rules to help us get past this moment. And of course, ultimately, Congress opens, the moment it is passed, and he did not allow his personal feelings of doom to get in the way. He clung to a rule book, you can call it side rails, rules, precedent, norms. He turned to them at a time of middling crisis for guidance. You can't always say that what you do is going to work, and sometimes a middling crisis becomes an extreme crisis. But there are all kinds of guardrails and guides and different things that you can turn to at that moment, a middling moment of crisis, and at least consider what you want to do. I've talked before about this as far as the Constitutional Convention and what the people who took part in framing the Constitution thought that they were doing in addition to structuring a government. They assumed that they were providing a kind of base that could be turned back to during moments of crisis. As Jefferson said after the election of 1800, when someone says, what would you have done if someone had prevented the election from happening, if Federalists had tried to seize the presidency, whatever. And Jefferson says, well, we would have had a convention and we would have tweaked the Constitution, and then we would go on. That's precisely the kind of logic that applies or should apply in a middling crisis that at least has the hope of not allowing it to escalate into something worse. So, sometimes rhetoric is just rhetoric, even though it's bad and we should notice it. Sometimes threats are only threats. The book that I recently wrote, it's a book full of Southerners making threats against Northerners. And the threats are powerful because Northerners think that the Southerners might follow through on the threats. And if they believe that the Southerners might follow through, the Southerners actually don't have to do anything after they've made the threat. The power's there. And probably many people who are threatened in that way, that rhetorical way, are going to back down, or never stand up, right? It's going to have an impact. It's going to intimidate people, as these kinds of threats are meant to. And that's just an example of the importance of thinking about, in a sort of middling crisis, what's being done, who's doing it, why are they doing it, and what's the real threat? Is there a real threat? Just again, consider what's going on and remember that in a kind of middling moment, there are guides there in place that are important. And if the other team is abandoning the guides, that's more reason for you to start looking at them and thinking about them and trying to come up with actual ways to respond to a crisis being created by people abandoning norms and rules and laws and standards. Okay. The last category, I'm only going to go a little bit long, I think. The last category is bad looming patterns of crises. And by this, I mean, uh-oh moments, right? Uh-oh crises, where you can kind of see things happening. They're not really necessarily totally alarming because they're either sporadic, they're kind of happening here and there. It's unclear what they add up to, or if they add up to anything, or you yourself are saying, well, yeah, I could see this happening in Florida, Texas, and Oklahoma. What does that mean? I don't know. Is it going to go beyond them? I don't know. And perhaps I just prefer to think that, oh, well, there's going to be quirky red states out there, and I'm just going to think that way. Or perhaps you're going to say to yourself, this is a pattern. Using Prager school lessons that are inherently aimed at preaching bad history to students getting used in different states, right? That's bad. It's happening in a couple of places. Might it happen elsewhere? Sure could, right? But that's a pattern to look at. Oh, look, it's happened in more than one place. Happens in one place, that's bad. Happens in two places, uh-oh. So I suppose uh-oh is what should be happening in your head for this third kind of crisis. Don't know yet if it's a crisis, but it sure could be. And what's alarming is the pattern that you're seeing set in motion. An example of this, two examples of this, and again, I'm going to speed up. I want you guys to be able to ask questions. Two examples of this sort of, uh-oh, let me think about what's happening and how to respond. One of them is actually, logically, takes place during the Revolution, and it involves George Washington, right? George Washington, Commander-in-Chief of Continental Army, towards the beginning of the war, his little continental troops against the British. They're an obvious threat. And on some level, he, like everyone, must have been thinking, wow, like we're doing this. Look like we're doing this. But so he, at an early point, considered, he and his staff of generals, what patterns were they seeing? What might the unfolding events teach them about the way to act in this uh-oh moment? What he noticed, and what others noticed, was that the British really had a hard time supplying their forces in the colonies. The British assumed that there were going to be all kinds of loyalists who were going to rush up and defend the British, whatever they did, and they definitely overestimated that. So when Washington took a step back, he was like, oh, interesting, the British really, they have a supply problem. So you know what? Prolonging what's going on here, just extending the war on and on in a way and making it, forcing the British to tramp all over through different colonies, retreating from seeming battles to just force us to fight another day. That could be a really effective strategy. The strategy of effective strategic retreat to prolong things, to hopefully destroy or at least seriously weaken the British effort. That was a pause, here is a response kind of response. And it was a good response. Now it did, kind of reminding us of John Adams, it did cost both Americans and British to attack him, right? There were some Americans who thought he was cowardly or, you know, bad general and attacked him for it. Like, why is he always retreating? And there were British, actually, in this worked to Washington's favor, who underestimated him essentially and thought, I don't know what he's doing, but he's really not good, and underestimated him as a general, and that was not a good thing to do. So the pattern kind of crisis, the other end of the spectrum kind of a crisis, those are moments where you can see the patterns, you should be looking for patterns, you should consider the implications of what you're seeing, you should talk to others about what you see and what you're thinking about it. Don't just exist in your own personal silo of angst. That's not good. And it's easy to do. I can tell you from experience. Talk to others, as we do here every week, about what you're seeing and about what's worrying you. Discuss and consider possible responses. Consider the long-term outcomes and implications of whatever you're considering doing. Don't respond with an impulse of the moment. Sometimes that'll work. Sometimes that really won't, and it'll make things work. So consider long-term outcomes. Consider not just posterity, but if we set this example now, what happens if political fates turn and suddenly the other side has the power that we just planted into the political battlefield? Consider outcomes and implications, and then come together with others and decide on a course of action. Now, you could argue, I thought about this morning, that people who attacked the Capitol on January 6th did precisely this, right? Saw patterns, didn't like it, were convinced that the election was a fraudulent election somehow, were convinced that the nation was going to go up in flames if President Biden became president, talked with others, made a plan, and decided on a course of action. However, considering the long-term implications of what they did probably didn't play a real role here, because the implications of storming into the Capitol and trying to overturn a presidential election, that does not reflect what are the broader implications of what we're doing here. Those are the kinds of responses that you have to moment of extreme crisis where you do something, and even at that moment should be pausing enough to consider the long-term implications of what you do, the precedents you're setting, the guide rails that you're tossing over, the norms that you're violating. Whatever you're doing in politics, however dire the crisis, you have to consider the so what of your doing that thing. So I suppose that I have a little bit more that I can say, but I've gone on beyond where I should. So I want to pause so that you guys have time to ask questions. I will say one last thing, which is my talking about the need to join with others, to discuss what you're seeing, to consider what it means. That's what we do here every week. That is the conversation of democracy, folks. That's what I'm talking about. Coming together with other people to discuss what's happening, to consider the implications, to think about different ways of responding. That's, no matter where you are on the spectrum of crisis, that's smart to do. And that is the conversation of democracy, because it only takes place between people who believe that those conversations will give them a chance to act in a way that matters. So, okay, I don't actually, I know mug, I haven't seen the mug, but I know it's coming. If there are folks here who are new, every week for now 180 weeks, how's that happening? I have found a mug that has something to do with, thank you, Carolee. I see one little on the bottom of my screen. A mug that has something to do with the topic that we're talking about, and admittedly, sometimes it's a long stretch. But this one, I think, kind of relates. it's a mug of a very different spirit, but I think you'll see. I think you'll agree that you can stretch with me in this direction. It says, be good to yourself. And then it says how. It says, relax. Ask for help. Call a friend. So it basically, in one way or another, is preaching a version of what I just talked about. It also says things I wouldn't advise. Abandon worry. Right, like really? Wishing upon a star also is not going to help very much. But at any rate, the general idea there of pausing and thinking, and even, you know, yourself in your own moment, having that kind of moment to pause and think, I stand behind that, and so does the random person. I think I bought this in Hawaii. Makes sense somehow that it comes from Hawaii. Okay, now I'm going to shut up. I went like 9 minutes long, and I want to open things up to questions.
They're already planning mugs and t-shirts about the Freeman crisis spectrum.
That was the last thing I thought of this morning as I was like sitting down to set things up. I had it all set up, and then I was like, and I tweeted about it. I was like, it's the spectrum of crisis. I could, and then it got my name attached as I offered it to you today. So anyway, yes.
You're planning a whole product line. Okay, so we have questions, and we have one from someone named Ernie, and I think Ernie might be new. I don't remember Ernie being in our group before. So I said, if you're new, you know, let us know. And I explained how Slack works and all that good stuff. But Ernie,
welcome.
I know, welcome. And if you've been with us for a while and just been kind of silent, we're glad you brought in a question.
Yeah.
And he's been now he's all over the chat. Okay, so Ernie asks, is there any hypothesis to possibly explain in a historical perspective all the empires we say are US allies, with France the only one in which the US has not had an armed conflict? We have, haven't we? Oh, but anyway, is this the one we most routinely access 2 centuries of ridicule or hate upon? Like, what other empires historically have we called allies?
Oh,
And then the one we routinely across 2 centuries ridicule or don't like.
oh, well, I mean, this may not, I'm not absolutely sure if what I'm going to say now is going to help address the question. So you can tell me if it isn't, but it's actually an important part of what I was just saying about pausing and considering. The fact of the matter is, don't take anything for granted, right? And just because you've been allies at one moment doesn't mean you're going to be allies again. And we see that in the short term a lot. I mean, during the Trump presidency, there were moments where it was like, wait, what? We're friends with who? We're not friends with what? We're not talking to who? Really? And you can see how it's possible for, in a very short amount of time, for a meaningful international relationship to be at least temporarily shattered. So and again, I'm not, you tell me, Annie, if you think that's kind of the direction that this question is going. Is that kind of what Ernie is asking? Or Ernie, is that kind of what you're asking?
Yeah, Ernie, clarify if we didn't do it justice in the chat for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's what I think he was getting at.
And that's it's a good question, because it's precisely a version of what I was asking for, which is, yeah, you should think about the fact that that can happen, because it can happen. And the chance that it can happen needs to be considered and might shift where on the spectrum of crises you put a particular moment. So it's an important consideration. It's contingency, right? Considering that everything is contingent, particularly when you're thinking about history in the long term.
Yeah. I think about, all the Japanese commerce that we have back and forth. I think a third of the automobiles are from Japan and the United States and Italy, people that we considered our greatest enemies. And we teach that way, like during World War II. And then now, yeah, lots of good examples going on in the chat, especially for the teachers. Okay, so Dave and Dale each have a few questions in here. So I'm going to try and hit some of those now. It says, can you think of an example in which Franklin would have fit into your pause, think, respond strategy to a crisis?
Okay, well, so Franklin had many talents. Benjamin Franklin had many talents. And one of them was his wit and ability to engage personally with other people in an appealing, sort of welcoming kind of a way. backed up with really strong principles and spine, right? But there were various moments at which, at a moment of crisis, he didn't necessarily wave his, poor Hamilton's going to be the waving the sword above his head like symbol for this entire conversation. His response was not that sort of what, but it was really more like, okay, I'm now going to state this, this, and this, and see how you respond. I know what I think of the situation, and I know what I think of you in this situation. I'm going to give you a chance to notice that what you're doing is inherently wrong or problematic, to notice that the colonies might get really upset if you continue to do what you're going to do. And let's see what you do with that moment. He used humor and wit to do that really effectively too. I mean, that's a great strategy. If you can master that at a crisis, you know, I talk about some examples of that in my most recent book, where some Southerner is like raging and threatening some, in this case, it was a senator, and it was, you know, threats, bad things. And the New Hampshire senator had the best sense of humor in the Senate at that moment. And he says, wait a moment. I need to look up some words in the dictionary that you're throwing at me, because they might not have totally clear meanings. He says, can an aide bring me a dictionary, right? And everything stops. And one of the pages brings him a dictionary, and he flips to one or the two of the words, and he reads out the examples like, this might apply, this doesn't apply. And he makes it so comical, and everyone starts laughing. And the irate Southerner is like, like deflated. So humor can be really effective. And I think Franklin, obviously in print, he showed that, but I think generally as a person, he was a very good diplomat, because he knew what he considered to be right and wrong. He knew the peril inherent at a moment of crisis, or a seeming moment of crisis. And then he could create at least the moment for consideration of the response on the part of the people committing the wrong.
Okay, we've got all kinds of stuff going on in the chat based on what you just said. Okay, so Dave asks, it seems like we're in a legal crisis. Will there be equal protection under the law for a former president and those in his orbit? How will historians view the legal matters in 50 years, 100 years? And how can we today take a future historian's view on legal matters to digest the fire hose of legal day-to-day notions and rulings?
Yes, and that's a great example of some people not thinking about long-term implications, right? That no one is above the law. No one is above the law, and a president shouldn't be. And that and I think I maybe last week talked about this, my colleague Tim Snyder said that having a trial, you know, putting a president on trial for crimes, that's actually the glory of America's judicial system, because he deserves a fair trial, and he'll get a fair trial, and he's not just being jailed, or, you know, something horrible is not happening to him. Actually, there's a judicial process that will go into effect to ensure that he gets fair treatment. Granted, our judicial process is not always fair on any level, not just with presidents, but the broader idea that somehow or other, because one person is who one person is, that they shouldn't be held responsible for alleged crimes, that's thinking long-term, just tossing over the rule of law. It's stating that this person, we think, because they're powerful and we like this person and we want this person to have power still, somehow the law doesn't apply to him in the way that it applies to everybody else. That's obviously an inherently dangerous, bad way to proceed, because if you begin to do that with a person here and a person there, you are overturning the rule of law. You're essentially saying, well, some people will face justice and some won't. Maybe they're powerful and they won't face justice. Maybe they have money and they won't face justice. We already have inherent problems in our legal system, but deliberately choosing to cause those, deliberately walking your way in, this man will not be held liable. That's an example of something that really, really sets a bad precedent, and that is being, not surprisingly, kind of hazed in or clouded in by some of the responses of people who don't want the former president to be charged with or to have to go through a trial. So the idea that, I don't want this to happen because if they can do this to him, to the former president, they can do it to anyone. It. What is the it? The it is he allegedly committed crimes and is going to have a trial. If you didn't commit allegedly a crime, it's not, what's happening there isn't random thing happening to a person and you too might have a random thing happen to you. No, it's someone who seems to have broken laws, who should have a trial in which that is discussed. If you don't break laws, it's not an identical situation. So I guess it's a roundabout way of my saying that's a moment where people who are saying he's above the law are really, on the one hand, in a way, not thinking about the long-term implications, but in another way they are, because in one way they're assuming that they deserve to have power and deserve to stay in power, and so warping things at the present, might not matter so much. And again, I'm talking about broad categories here, and I don't tend to like to do that, and which is why you'll see when I post things on social media, I will always, or at least I hope to always say some on the right, because I don't want to say the right in the same way that there isn't the left. But that's certainly how some people on the right are reasoning.
So Dale asks, he references George Washington, and he wanted to know, would retreat, regroup, react be a subset of your three strategies, thinking about George Washington?
Retreat, regroup, react. Well, but retreat is react, right? I might be misunderstanding. Yeah, I might be misunderstanding you. I would say retreat, regroup, react are kind of a bundle to me rather than a step-by-step process. But yeah, retreat doesn't always have to be the reaction. For him, I would say, evaluate, react, retreat, was a bundle of things. So I'm not quite absolutely sure what you're asking. But I would say together, those things represent one of his strategies of responding to crises. Maybe that's what you're trying to get at.
All right. Our friend Kathy Porter. Hi, Kathy. Kathy asks, she says, maintaining guardrails or norms could be the reason for maintaining the filibuster despite calls for its removal. She's asking kind of like the Harry Reid rule for judicial approvals in the Senate. So she wanted to know if you could comment on that.
Well, so that's a really good point. Is that considering implications, one might think considering implications means don't change the rules, right? That, consider the rules, stick by the rules. And I don't think that that's the case either. I think there are cases, there's a reason why the Constitution is amendable, right? You can amend it because no one assumed that the same situation would always be in effect at all times, that new things would come up, new situations, all kinds of things that could not be anticipated in the late 18th century. But there's a system through which, in essence, you're forced to get together, to discuss, to debate, to reason, to ratify. There's a whole long process before you can amend the Constitution. And this kind of feels as though it fits into the same category, which is creating the filibuster, altering the way that the filibuster happens, making it impossible to filibuster, whatever people are saying. I think it's valid to raise the idea, and then you need to have a conversation, a responsible conversation, a discourse, a discussion on all sides, where everyone in good faith talks to everybody else about the long-term implications of what's going on and gets past the immediate usefulness of changing that kind of rule. Now, that said, I just studied Congress for a whole chunk of time, and there are countless examples of people in the moment finding partisan advantage in changing the rules, right? So it's not like that doesn't happen. It happens, and it will happen again. But ideally speaking, there are some people who are willing to talk to each other and some people who are willing to consider broader implications. Sometimes that doesn't matter. And this is an important point, because I talk about my spectrum of crises and different things that happen and why they're alarming or not alarming. And it is true and important to note that some of the crises that we're experiencing now are certainly not new. And the idea, for example, of people changing the rules in Congress for partisan advantage, that's not new, right? And the fact that it's happening now in and of itself, I don't know where it falls on my spectrum, but when you put that in a context of everything that's happening around it and the ways in which democracy is or isn't being treated or respected around it, it has a different implication. So it's context is as important as pausing to consider. One individual thing by itself, changing the rules, it's happened before, but if you're changing those rules at a moment when all of these other things are happening at the same time, which I guess gets back to my end of the spectrum, the uh-oh, then changing the rules on the filibuster becomes an uh-oh, because what am I seeing elsewhere? So like good historians, we have to always remember context, the broader context of what we're seeing, which gets at, and I don't remember if it's this question or the one before where someone said, in 10 years, 50 years, what are historians going to say? They will know the broad context, right? I think about this all the time. It's not surprising, given that I'm a historian. I think about someone seeing something that happens or seeing a decision that's made, understanding the what's going on everywhere, and as a historian thinking, really? Like, given what happened there, and given that it appears to have been obvious that this was happening, they made that choice. Those are the kinds of situations I love to address as a historian. I love that. It's like, this seems inherently bonkers. How does it make sense? And that's how you sometimes can arrive at, oh, this is a blatantly partisan move, or, oh, it makes sense in the culture of the moment. But we are living in a time that's going to create PhD dissertations for all eternity, because there's so many things. What is someone going to think when they see people trying to pass laws to prevent people from wearing masks at a time when we now know that COVID is just going to be around? How do you make sense of that, right? If you're 50 years in the future, what's the logic of that? Well, given science, the logic is certainly not somehow this is going to serve people in a good way. That it becomes partisan, and then you have to evaluate it that way. So, historians have the luxury of being able, they already are stepping back and considering. They're struggling to step back less. They're struggling to get closer to the moment, but they will be able to see all of the inherent paradoxes and craziness and things that should never happen, and things that are total reversals and hypocrisy and everything else that is an ongoing fire hose in our time. They'll be able to see that, and they'll be able to consider it. They won't all come to the same conclusions, because there is not one sort of, all historians think the same thing. We are debating and conversing and creating history with different questions at different moments. But historians will be able to see things that we should be seeing now, and that we would see more if we stepped back and thought about it, but that a lot of people don't want to or can't see.
Okay, we've got so many more questions. I'm going to combine two Gloria questions because I think they go together. She asked your thoughts on the long-term consequences of putting a president on trial and what will prevent that trial from becoming a show trial. She asked, if there's so much publicity and people already declaring him guilty, do you think he could still get a fair trial?
I mean, I believe in democracy, so I like to believe that, yes, he can get a fair trial. I think that's a valid question. And I think whatever happens, there's going to have to be some careful thinking and planning in a just way, in a way that actually it has the intention of creating a fair trial, that isn't coming in from a partisan angle, but is just people understanding. And there are people there, we hear them commenting, right? The rule of law matters. It matters, and it needs to be upheld. So whatever goes on here, he deserves a fair trial, and we have to find a way to give him a fair trial. That needs to happen. So, can he have a fair trial? I believe yes. Will it be easy? I believe no. I think most of us would say no, but then that's the challenge of the legal system of justice. You have to adapt to what's going on, relying on the Constitution and legality and rules and the law to help guide you, and precedent, to help guide you as to what you can do to create an optimal moment of justice setting. I think the fact that it's difficult doesn't mean that it shouldn't be done. I don't think the fact that we think it can't happen is a reason to not do it. I think that's irresponsible, and that's not thinking about it, the long-term implications. To say it's hard, I don't think he can have a fair trial, so let's not try him. If you follow that logic, there's really problematic logic. This is really important. It's so important that we shouldn't do it because he might not get a fair trial. Wait a minute. If it's that important, then we need to really think about the trial. And again, I'm not sure if that's, there is, Carolee is right. There's lots of problematic logic all over, indeed. So, and I realize and I thought about this when I was, typing up my comments this morning. There aren't a lot of hard and fast lines where there should be sometimes, even when you're talking about, the Constitution and the law. People find all kinds of ways to either put in or take advantage of wiggle room. So, but that's the precise reason why I think you need to do what I was preaching throughout today's episode, to take a breath before responding, because, and that's a really good point from Carolee, right? There's problematic logic all over. Yes. And so that's the precise reason why you have to pause and think, and ideally talk to other people. It's in my brain right now. The fact that I can turn to Heather, or she can turn to me, and I can say, or she can say, what do you think of this thing that's happening? And I know what it's making me think. And we did this a lot. I hope we continue to do it. I'd slide into her DMs. I actually said that here, being recorded. But I would say, I thus and such is making me think thus and such. What do you think? And without doing that, I would probably be sitting here in a state of angst. Oh no, I'm really good at uh-oh. But talking to someone and thinking about it and considering the implications of it, that's what we need to be doing a lot now, in a state of good faith and not in a state of panicky angst. Good faith is important here, and there's a shortage of that too. People not being willing to engage with each other in a state of good faith, but really just trying to find an advantage. And again, not necessarily new. What you're doing there, newbie? Not necessarily new, but some things are going to have particular special importance at the kind of moment that we're in now, where we have a particular conglomeration of crises in our current moment, and we have to address it as it exists, and not sort of piece it apart and address things out of context or alone.
All right. Do we have time for one more, do you think? We're 2 minutes over.
Let's do one more.
Okay. Daniel asks, he says, part of the issue is that those who, excuse me, dropped my phone. He says, people think that those who are raising the issue in a public venue are actually raising a conspiracy theory in a public venue. So these take huge amounts of effort to debunk. The example of Hawaii, there was a MMA fighter who's always ranting about his state government, disrupting public meetings, making accusations. And he's curious if these types of people will actually get sued for defamation, but because there's just so many of them, how do we triage?
Right. No, it's a really good question. And it's also an important reminder that pausing and considering and talking, there are different ways to do that. And finding as loud a megaphone as you can possibly have doesn't necessarily feel as though it's the best way to have a conversation, right? So sued for defamation, sometimes that needs to happen. Again, that's if you're being defamed, to use a wonderful 18th century word, in some way, that legally, that is illegal, you have a right to stand up and say, no, right? Again, that's our judicial system. That's why it's there. You have rights to a fair trial. And maybe what you do will be supported, what you're suggesting will be supported, and maybe it won't. But it's the possibility of either happening that's important. So I don't have a solution to what do we do when there are people ranting at the top of their lungs, not necessarily in good faith, not wanting a discussion, but just wanting to dominate TV and print and whatever else, and be loud and give people the impression that they represent a majority. That's going to happen. That's just going to happen. That's not, again, not necessarily new. That becomes just another reason why, for example, we can sit here and say, okay, there are people who are really loud at school board meetings. Let's consider for a moment, how many of them are there and how much do we really believe that they represent the majority? And if we had that conversation, the loud voices might still be problematic, but we might come to realize, and actually not a majority, like consider loudness versus size are not the same thing. So that's an example of a conversation, not necessarily on a megaphone, but between people thinking about a moment, reckoning with it, coming to terms with it, and then talking with others. That could be useful. And again, our government is grounded on public opinion in one way or another, and that could be good and that could be bad, depending on how the public is swayed. But our opinion matters. It does. It's why there's so much effort made to appeal to us all the time. Lying and hypocrisy and all of that stuff to us. Why put all of that effort into swaying or sort of misleading us? Why? Because what we think matters. It does. All of what we're seeing, all the stuff that we're deeming, and rightly so, that's unfair, misleading, problematic, dangerous, they're doing it because they need to address us and include us, and because we have the power. If we come together and decide that we do or don't like something, we can have an impact. That's part of democracy, right? I mean, that's a version of accountability. The public can come together and decide something and then turn to the people with power and say, we don't like that, actually, and you're accountable for it. I realize that in our current time, some of what I'm talking about sounds daydreamy, like, oh yes, you come together and have a fair discourse. But I inherently believe in democracy and that it can work. But as a political process, it will never go of itself. It requires conversations of democracy. Okay, that was 6 minutes after. That kind of feels like an end, right?
Yep, we still had 2 good questions, but we almost always do. We'll just have to.
And maybe sometimes with leftover questions, I look at them and see if I can corral them into another episode. Often it doesn't work because the topic for the following week that feels pressing is so different that I can't. But still, I always like to see them to find if there's a way that I can.
So Jessica can email those to us.
Yes. Okay.
All right. Do you want to explain what happens next?
I will explain what happens next. So we are now going to go to the after party. What that means is that we will no longer be recording what's going on so that we can be even freer and easier than we've been already. And we can talk about whatever we want to talk about. If you beamed in through the NCHE website, stay right where you are and poof, you will be in the after party. If you are watching us on Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and go to ncheteach.org/conversations. That's ncheteach.org/conversations. And then you too, poof, will be in the after party. Particularly this week, thank you for engaging in the conversation of democracy on a Friday morning. It's always important and we always know that. But today I got to really emphasize that, and that's a good thing. But truly, for ever so many reasons, personal, political, and otherwise, democratic, social, it's so important that we and others do this kind of thing. And the fact that we've been doing it as long as we have, as earnestly as we have, really, really, really matters. And sometimes in an educational context, the fact that it's the National Council for History Education sponsoring this, and that there are a lot of educators here, the conversation of democracy and education are intertwined. So that makes it even more important what we're doing here. So thank you for being here. I hope that you all have a wonderful week. And that depending on where you are and the crowds that you're in, that you are careful and if necessary, wear masks, because sure seems like a lot of people are getting COVID just based on my immediate experience, particularly with school starting. Be careful. I feel like, what is it, Hill Street Blues? Be careful out there. Be careful and take care of yourself. And we will be here again next week. And I want to thank Jessica and Annie, as ever, for being here and guiding us through and making this possible and being essential to our wonderful History Matters community. Daniel says, an old reference, but a good one. I am full of old references because it's popular culture and it's all in my brain. It totally is. Anyway, Annie, thank you so much, as ever, for you just like steer and guide, and I don't even know how you do it, but you do it seamlessly and make it look easy, and then even comment while you're doing it. Every once in a while I'm like, and she's commenting, I just saw her name whiz by. So
31
yes,
years in the classroom.
still
You learn to multitask.
Sydney just said Annie is awesome. Annie is awesome. So okay,
Right, we're
So
ready for the voice.
The Voice. We will now segue to
Look up and stop recording.
after party to wait for The Voice to sign us out and for Facebook to go away.